The Chinese were almost at the crest. It was late in the afternoon of 4 November 1951, and the message traveling through B Company's battered trench system was not the kind anyone wanted to hear. The left shoulder of the ridge, the most vulnerable point in the entire position, was collapsing. Several NCOs had gone down. The men holding that sector were outnumbered, exhausted, and running out of options. A private from B Company headquarters heard what was happening and made a decision that no one ordered him to make. He found a pile of grenades near the trench. He looked at the men around him and called for volunteers. 6 of them stepped forward. No briefing, no plan beyond the immediate problem. The enemy was not waiting for either. What followed over the next several hours would earn William Speakman the Victoria Cross. The first one presented by a new queen to a soldier who had no business still being on that hill by the end of it. To understand what happened on that Korean hillside, you need to understand what the war had become. The conflict had started in 1950 with dramatic movement, armies racing across a peninsula, maps redrawn overnight, North Korean forces surged south. United Nations troops counterattacked north, then China entered and pushed back south. In a single year, the front line oscillated across hundreds of miles. By autumn 1951, all of that was over. The war had calcified. Armistice negotiations had begun at Kaesong in July, but talks were grinding and slow. Both sides kept fighting, not to win outright, but to hold ground and strengthen their hand at the table. The peninsula was no longer a fluid battlefield. It was a network of ridge lines and fortified hills, each one contested with grim ferocity. And in Korea, the hills were everything. The central spine of the peninsula is brutal terrain, steep ridges rising sharply from narrow valleys, commanding views over enemy road and supply route below. Whoever owned the high ground could direct artillery fire over vast distances. Whoever didn't was essentially blind and exposed. So the hills became the whole war. Trenches followed narrow crests. Fighting positions were blasted out of stone. Machine guns covered every likely approach. It was First World War style fighting transplanted into Korean terrain. Grinding, attritional, punishing. Men lived in holes in the earth for weeks, enduring cold nights and the constant possibility of assault. The Chinese relied on mass and momentum, large infantry formations moving under covering fire, mortars softening targets, attackers using ground folds to close with startling speed before hitting the trench line hard. It was designed to overwhelm through sheer weight and shock. The 1st Commonwealth Division held positions north of the Imjin River, and within it, the 29th Independent Infantry Brigade manned a critical stretch of the line. One of the brigade's battalions was the 1st Battalion, the King's Own Scottish Borderers. They had recently fought hard to capture a series of hills near Maryangsan and now held what they'd taken. In the brutal logic of hill warfare, that meant those same hills now had to be defended, because nothing demoralized a unit quite like losing ground you'd bled to capture. Life on those ridges was an exercise in sustained misery. The ground was rough and exposed, supplies had to be manhandled up steep tracks, and cold winds swept across the crests with a thoroughness that no amount of layering could fully defeat. Sleep came in short, restless stretches. Every section of the line depended on the one next to it. The defense held together only as long as every part of it held firm. By early November, the signs of another major assault were unmistakable. There's nothing in William Speakman's early life that announces what he would become. He was born in 1927 in Altrincham, a town in Cheshire, in the northwest of England. His was a working-class upbringing, steady, practical, shaped by the discipline that comes from not having much. He went to Wellington Road School in Timperley and was, by all accounts, unremarkable in the way most young men who end up doing remarkable things tend to be unremarkable beforehand. He grew up as Europe slid toward catastrophe. By the time he was a teenager, the Second World War had arrived in Britain. Air raid sirens punctuating ordinary days. rationing reshaping every meal, soldiers passing through train stations as casually as commuters. For his generation, living under the threat of sudden violence was not an exceptional state. It was just Tuesday. After the war ended in 1945, Speakman enlisted and joined the Black Watch, formerly the Royal Highland Regiment, one of the oldest infantry regiments in the British Army. It had fought across Europe, Africa, and Asia, and regarded complaint as a form of weakness to be discouraged. During the Korean War, Speakman was attached to the 1st Battalion, the King's Own Scottish Borderers, serving as a private in B Company headquarters. He was not a frontline rifleman in the most traditional sense. Headquarters company soldiers handled communications, supplies, and the 100 administrative functions that keep a fighting unit functional. But on a ridge in Korea, those distinctions had a way of evaporating when casualties mounted. There was one physical fact about William Speakman that everyone who met him seemed to remember. He was 6 feet 6 inches tall. In a trench system engineered for men considerably shorter, this was less of a tactical advantage than it might sound. It did mean he was hard to miss, hard to forget, and very hard to ignore. But height is simply a measurement. It doesn't make a man courageous. It doesn't make him steady when the ground is shaking around him. It doesn't make him move forward when every instinct says otherwise. What lay ahead would require something height can't provide. The morning of 4 November 1951 arrived in darkness and noise. At 4 a.m., the first Chinese shells began falling across the ridge. Mortars and artillery struck the defensive positions with methodical persistence, shaking the frozen ground and showering the trenches with dirt and shattered rock. Telephone lines, the nervous system of any defensive position, were cut almost immediately. Men hunkered down and waited for the fire to lift. It didn't lift. The shelling continued through the morning and deep into the afternoon, with a patience that was itself a form of violence. The slow, grinding destruction of morale alongside the destruction of positions. By around 3:45 p.m., the bombardment intensified. The explosions walked deliberately along the crest line like something searching for a particular target. Smoke thickened over the slopes. Visibility dropped. The ground itself seemed to be shaking apart. Anyone who had been through this before knew what heavy, sustained bombardment usually meant. The shells were not the main event. The shells were the announcement. At around 4:45 p.m., they came. Large formations of Chinese infantry emerged and began moving toward the ridge, using every fold and depression in the ground to close the distance. Machine guns opened up from both sides as the attackers came on. Mortar rounds continued to fall behind the defensive line, limiting movement between sections and isolating individual positions at their most vulnerable moment. The light was fading. By 5:45 p.m., the fighting had reached the forward edge of the position. In some sections, it had gone beyond grenades and rifle fire. Men were fighting in the trenches themselves, in the particular desperation of close-quarter combat, where the distances involved are measured in feet rather than yards. The noise was total. The left shoulder of the company position, the part of the ridge that curved slightly forward, awkward to reinforce and harder to support with fire from adjacent positions, was taking the worst of it. Casualties had been mounting there all day. Several NCOs had been wounded and pulled back. The men holding that section were fewer now, tired, and actually aware that they were the weakest point in the line. If the attackers broke through there, they wouldn't just take a trench. They would be behind the rest of the company, able to roll up the position from the flank. The entire defensive line in that sector would unravel. B Company was holding on, but only just. It was at this moment that William Speakman learned how serious the situation on that shoulder had become. What Speakman did next was not, strictly speaking, his job. He was headquarters company. There were officers and NCOs who should have been coordinating the response to a threatened sector. But this was a battlefield in the late afternoon of a terrible day, and the officer situation had been considerably simplified by enemy fire. Speakman went to where the grenades were and started gathering them. He looked around at the men nearest to him and asked plainly, who was coming with him? 6 soldiers stepped forward. No one dressed it up. No one made a speech. There was no time for the kind of moment that gets cleaned up in retrospect. He led the first charge down toward the threatened trench. The Chinese troops who had reached the position were hit suddenly and at close range. Grenades thrown in rapid succession broke up the forward group and forced them back from the crest. The sheer unexpected aggression of it bought the defenders in that section a moment to breathe, to reposition, to hold. Then more attackers came. Speakman led another charge. And when those attackers came forward again, he led another. The official record, compiled from witness accounts and after-action reports, states that Speakman led approximately 10 separate assaults over the course of the battle. 10 times he gathered a small group and moved forward into the fire. 10 times he drove the attackers back from that section of the trench line. There was a grim, almost mechanical quality to it. Not recklessness, but an iron refusal to let the position go. Every time the Chinese forces regrouped and pressed forward, there was Speakman again, moving toward them instead of away from them. During one of these charges, he was wounded seriously in the leg. He was treated and returned to the fight. This bears dwelling on for a moment. A severe leg wound on a steep hillside during an ongoing assault at night in the middle of the 10th hour of a battle, and he went back. Not because someone ordered him to. There is no record of anyone ordering him to. He went back because the section still needed him, and he was still capable of moving. As darkness settled over the ridge, the fighting continued. Enemy forces pushed again toward the crest. Speakman pushed back. The ground near that section of the trench changed hands in the most immediate sense. Not armies maneuvering across kilometers, but individual men fighting for a strip of frozen Korean hillside a few meters wide. Later that night, orders came down for B Company to withdraw to a new defensive position. In tactical terms, this was a planned repositioning, not a rout. But there's nothing simple about moving a company off a contested hilltop in the dark while under fire. Disorder in that situation became catastrophe very quickly. Speakman led one final charge, not to hold the position permanently, but to push the attackers back far enough to give the company the space it needed to withdraw in good order. To move deliberately rather than to flee. To carry the wounded. To leave as soldiers rather than as a mob. It worked. B Company withdrew in control. The position served its purpose in the fight. No one was left behind through chaos or panic. That was what 10 charges accomplished. In the cold language of operational analysis, the events of 4 November 1951 affected only a small section of the front. No great strategic advantage changed hands. The broader war ground on for another 2 years. But tactical situations have their own logic. If that left shoulder had broken, B Company might have been surrounded. A rout there could have endangered adjacent units and produced the kind of confusion that multiplies casualties long after the initial breach. The defense of an interconnected ridge system functions like a chain. One broken link does not end neatly. Speakman's repeated assaults disrupted the rhythm of the Chinese attacks. Each time the attackers regrouped, they found aggressive counterpressure rather than an exhausted defense waiting to be overrun. This forced them to pause and reorganize. And in battle, time is never neutral. Every minute of delay is time defenders have to reinforce, treat casualties, and steady the men close to breaking. There's also something harder to quantify, the human effect. A defensive position under sustained attack is not merely a physical problem. It's a psychological one. Soldiers watch one another when things go wrong. Fear spreads. So does resolve, but only if someone demonstrates it first. In B Company on 4 November, that someone was a 6'6" private from headquarters who grabbed grenades and walked toward the sound of the fight. That kind of action doesn't appear in operational reports. It can't be mapped or measured. But ask any soldier who has served in sustained combat what matters most when a position is close to breaking, and the answer is almost always the same: someone who refuses to. The events of that night didn't vanish into the fog of war. After action reports were filed, officers wrote accounts. Witness statements were collected from men who'd been on that hill. What emerged was consistent and extraordinary enough to prompt a recommendation that traveled to the very highest level. The award was announced in the London Gazette on 28 December 1951. The official citation described Speakman's conduct as displaying most conspicuous bravery and inspiring leadership in the presence of the enemy. That phrasing is not deployed casually. The Victoria Cross is the highest military decoration in the British Armed Forces, awarded only for acts of valor performed in the presence of the enemy at personal risk. The bar is genuinely high, not in the bureaucratic sense, but in the sense that it describes a threshold of courage most people will never be called upon to approach. The approval came under King George VI. Before Speakman could receive the medal, the king died. When Speakman stood at Buckingham Palace for the investiture, it was Queen Elizabeth II who pinned the cross to his chest. He became, by that accident of timing, the first recipient of the Victoria Cross to be invested by the new queen. The medal itself is deceptively simple, a small cross pate cast from bronze, suspended from a crimson ribbon. On its face, just two words, for valor. No lengthy inscriptions, no complex heraldry. The brevity is the point. For Speakman, the award placed his name in a line of recipients stretching back more than 150 years. He was now part of that record, alongside men who had done exceptional things in exceptional circumstances. Many men who receive the Victoria Cross find themselves effectively defined by a single moment. The medal becomes the whole story. Everything else collapses into a footnote. Speakman's career resisted that reduction. After Korea, he served in the Malayan emergency, jungle warfare utterly unlike ridge fighting. Dense forest, limited visibility, small patrols moving for days through undergrowth, always alert for contact from any direction. Speakman was attracted for a time to the Special Air Service and took part in recovery patrols, going back into hostile terrain to bring out soldiers killed during operations against insurgents. For men who have served together, there are fewer things that matter more than bringing back the fallen. He subsequently served in Borneo during the Indonesia-Malaysia confrontation and in the Radfan Mountains of the Middle East. He accumulated years of operational experience in environments that would have broken many soldiers and carried them without visible drama. Over time, he was promoted to sergeant, responsible for turning recruits into capable fighters, maintaining discipline under pressure, being the person junior soldiers look to when officers go down. His career stretched through the late 1950s and into the 1960s. The long stretches of routine that constitute most military service rarely generate headlines, but they are what armies are actually made of. Speakman carried his share. Transition to civilian life is rarely easy for men whose entire adult existence has been structured around military service, and it was not entirely smooth for Speakman. At one point, facing genuine financial pressure, he sold his original Victoria Cross. His roof needed repair. The metal was valuable. The logic was straightforward, even if the symbolism sat uncomfortably with those who believed such things should never be parted with. Speakman seemed largely unbothered. The medal was an object. The thing it represented was not transferable. He later obtained a replacement for formal wear. He maintained connections to veterans organizations and appeared at commemorative events over the years. In 2006, he participated in a television documentary featuring Victoria Cross recipients, bringing renewed attention to actions taken half a century earlier. In his later years, Speakman became an in-pensioner at the Royal Hospital Chelsea, which had housed veteran soldiers since the reign of Charles II. The Chelsea pensioners wear their distinctive scarlet coats, take part in ceremonial occasions, and live in one of the most historically resonant buildings in London, a home and an honor both. In April 2015, now in his late 80s, Speakman traveled to Seoul for a ceremony honoring Korean War veterans. It was not a simple journey for an elderly man, but he made it. During the visit, he presented a replica of his Victoria Cross and associated medals to the people of South Korea, a gesture that carried the weight of everything the war had meant, of a distant nation defended by men who had no personal stake in it beyond the obligations of duty and alliance. The South Koreans, who had never forgotten what United Nations forces did in 1950 and 1951, received the gesture with the seriousness it deserved. William Speakman died on 20 June 2018 at the age of 90. Several months later, his ashes were interred at the United Nations Memorial Cemetery in Busan, South Korea. The cemetery holds the remains of service personnel from dozens of nations who gave their lives during the Korean War. It sits on a gentle hillside overlooking the sea, quiet, immaculately maintained, the sort of place that makes the scale of what happened feel comprehensible and human at the same time. He had fought in Korea. He had carried the memory of Korea for 67 years. In the end, Korea carried him. Some actions define a battle. Others define the man who performs them. In the rarest cases, they do both. On 4 November 1951, on a contested ridge in central Korea, a headquarters private gathered 6 volunteers and a pile of grenades and attacked an enemy that was in the process of overrunning his company's position. He did this not once, not twice, but approximately 10 times over the course of several hours. He did it after being seriously wounded. He did it in the dark, on a hillside, under fire, when everything rational would have justified stopping. The left shoulder of B Company's position held. The company withdrew in order. The men got off that hill. William Speakman went on to serve for years afterward in Malaya, Borneo, and the Middle East. He was promoted to sergeant. He trained younger soldiers in what he knew. He lived a full life beyond that one extraordinary night, and the medal he wore for the rest of it bore words that were, in his case, among the most precisely accurate 2 words ever inscribed on a decoration: for valor. Not for luck or circumstance, or being in the right place at the right time. Valor, the willingness to act when acting is the most dangerous possible choice. The refusal to stop when stopping would have been entirely understandable. The decision to go forward again when the body is already wounded and the light is gone and 10 charges have already been made into the same fire. That is what the medal means. That is who William Speakman was. I'm Dave. Thanks for watching. If this kind of history matters to you, hit subscribe, leave a comment. I genuinely read them. And I'll see you in the next one.
Oh, Dave.